I'm finally getting to the interview that I wanted. It just didn't happen with me. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. You may remember that I wanted to get an interview with Dr. Aria Halliday about her book, By Black, and it didn't happen. She did, though, a year ago, sit down with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal on his platform for a discussion of her work, and it's very revealing. So, what you're about to see are some of my thoughts on edited excerpts from that interview. The entire interview is linked in the show description, where you can see it uninterrupted, unedited, and in its entirety. I hope you do check it out. I highly recommend that you do. I also highly recommend that you read her book. So now that you've liked, shared, subscribed, joined the channel, and are ready to enjoy this video, let's get to it.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined here today by Professor Aria S. Halliday, Assistant Professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and Program in African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. She's the author of the just-published By Black, How Black Women Transform U.S. Pop Culture, published by our friends at the University of Illinois Press in April of 2022. Of By Black, Murray Miller Young writes, a brilliant and meticulously researched exploration of how ideas about representing Blackness have been essential to the story of American consumerism and popular culture, in uncovering how Black women has transformed corporate discourse of multiculturalism and diversity by inserting their own imaginations, capabilities, and desires. By Black provides an extraordinary feminist reading of the role of race, gender, and class in the American consumer product industry. Aria Halliday's book is essential reading. How are you doing today, Professor?
So that much I would agree with, that the book is essential reading. Where I struggle to come to terms is, to what extent does all of this Black in general, Black women specifically, involvement in corporate America, commercialism, marketing, and consumption has overturned power in any way? What is described often as women taking over, Black women taking over, is really them being co-opted and corrupted by an existing system that uses their genius and talent and capability against the interests of the collective. So this is so again, why I'm very interested to finally catch up with this interview.
Something about Barbie, there's something about Cinderella, there's something about Nikki that is really compelling, not only to a kind of pop culture environment, but to Black people, Black women specifically.
So but that's true, and that's kind of my point, or would be kind of my point. That is, Cinderella, the Barbie, all of that had already been imposed and orchestrated as core Eurocentric, European, Western, pop cultural, North American even aesthetics, value, worldview. The idea that a colonized and formerly enslaved population raised up in that imposed environment would itself suffer the consequences, never mind what it does to white girls, is really not, I think, a difficult leap to make. That is, again, the existing pop cultural aesthetic worldview that had already been established and imposed as that existing environment, McLuhan always says, is always beyond perception, would of course be reimagined among a colonized African population in a particular African way. So it wouldn't be reflected back to whiteness in exactly the way Europeans and white people would, but it would be reflected back in a very African-styled, performed Eurocentric method, all to ultimately appease that same very white, mostly affluent consuming audience. So what Nicki Minaj produces, what Black women produce in this context, as much as Black people may find it appealing, they find it appealing often because that's been the construct we've all been raised within and have had imposed on us, and B, their success materially, career-wise, is attached to the white audience that wants that Black reflected cultural expression and performance and is willing to consume it. So it's not reclamation of power. It certainly does nothing to materially enhance or improve the conditions of Black or African people, as all the data and the lived experience demonstrates. So that's why I think it's, as we're going to see, I think they're going to get to not too long from now, where it is important, I think, that concepts of buying power, capitalism, Black capitalism, need to be reconsidered as concepts, as imposed ideology. Again, similar to what Marisa Baradaran was saying recently about neoliberalism. It's an ideology, it's a construct that is meant to ease the extraction and the exploitation, not change it or reverse it or make amends.
I think I honed in on the fact that Black women consume and produce for themselves. They have themselves in mind. And so the book is really thinking about that relationship, that connection between, the women who are at the tables making the decisions between what we buy and the consumers who are like, this doesn't feel like it represents me, or this does represent me because it looks like this.
So, and again, I'll link to the previous video I did going through some of Professor Halliday's book, and I'll revisit it in coming weeks and months as I continue to struggle with this chapter. I'm still continuing to struggle writing. But this is a perspective, and I'm glad to be getting help in understanding her perspective in this interview, because this is one that I struggle with and I ultimately disagree with. That is, yes, Black women may be producing with themselves in mind, but they're doing it within a construct that does not benefit them. So when they're brought in as executives to work within Coca-Cola and other elite white corporations, or Barbie or Mattel or wherever they're being brought in to work, or the film industry, et cetera, they're being brought in maybe with themselves and even their communities in mind, but they're being brought into a construct and an environment that is only looking to mine that perspective and performance to have it be reflected back to society in a way that benefits this existing structure. So it becomes co-optive, and even collaborative, as opposed to change, corrective. So co-optive, maybe even collaborative in terms of the compliance of the colonized to participate, even unconsciously or unwittingly, but then it ultimately becomes corrupted.
One of the things I think in this particular moment, we don't question the fact that Black women as cultural producers and consumers are really pushing the narrative and pushing the industry to have to consider their buying power and then just their cultural influence, right? We can think about any number of white women, who've done various things to their hair and their bodies, their butts, in reaction to the influence of Black women.
Right.
But that's something we only really, I think, understand in this social media moment, right? When Black women are in a position to really control their narrative using Twitter and IG and TikTok and all these kinds of things, you really give us a larger historical narrative, right? This idea of how Black women have been incredible cultural influencers through their consumption products, right? And that it's not something that starts in this moment. Talk a little bit about that larger history.
But this speaks to so many the problems that I have with this approach. So again, buying power is not real. It's an advertising marketing concept that has nothing to do with the actual economic strength of a community. So discussing Black women's buying power as a power in the conventional sense misses the point. The industry is responding to what Black women are more or less, and Black people and anybody are both allowed to spend, have to spend, and are encouraged to spend, always assuring that expenditure is going to support existing productive capabilities, that is, white-owned products and corporate-made products who need to sell those products to develop the profit, et cetera, need to attract consumption. So the power in buying power is defined by those corporate entities. It is a power to enrich them. It is not a power to do anything else. So when Black women in this case are brought in both to market to and develop marketing strategies for Black women, it is the power of the corporations to usurp the potential, latent, undeveloped, and disorganized political power through social movements, etc., of Black women, of Black people, to redefine that as consumption, and consumption of products made by, with a profit ultimately benefiting that elite white community. The sort of trickle-down effect of this flawed approach is I'm seeing it here again, is that we misunderstand the relationship that we have, or that anyone has, to social media and the media environment. So when Mark Anthony Neal goes on to talk about the power of Black women to control their own narrative through Instagram and social media, it ignores, again, the material reality that has not changed and is not improving. It ignores the reports from these very entities, Instagram, Facebook, etc., that demonstrate the negative impact on particularly Black and brown girls that social media has. It ignores the work produced by Black women, some of it featured on this platform, that demonstrates the harmful effects on Black people, Black women in particular, of these social media spaces. So the idea that Black women or anyone else are controlling or taking control of a narrative is missing the point. The idea that somehow narrative control can be defined as major white-owned corporations adjusting their branding and marketing to target Black consumers devalues or completely destroys what should be the meaning of power and how most people conceive of the meaning of power. Again, we're talking about a power only defined by those elite corporations and rulers of this society to enrich and defend their existing place. It's not a power that we need to tap into, that is, again, latent, disorganized, to politically organized for social movements, for actual political power. This symbolic power is not it.
As much as Black people are invested in the politics of optics and representation, it's often when that is a concern of Black women and Black girls that such activities are treated as frivolous among some of my male colleagues, for example, that, folks don't necessarily see what the matter is to be concerned about what a doll looks like, right? In the larger context, right, of quote unquote achieving Black freedom. But you seem to counter that by suggesting the ways in which really mainstream Black leaders, including Garvey, were really invested in this kind of representation, right? And of course, we know the work that Mamie and Kenneth Clark, would do 2 decades later in regards to that. So talk a little bit about that, what seems like a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, part of my purpose in studying what seems like kind of frivolous and innocuous kinds of items is that people are buying, Black women especially, but other people are also highly invested in what these dolls look like because they communicate something about our political commitments as Black people, right? Garvey is really interested in how we not only do this larger political project around Black people going back to Africa, about beautiful and amazing, but what do we do with that Blackness as we age, right? And I think, from Garvey to Anna Julia Cooper to, there's so many other examples. People are highly invested in this conversation. And I think, part of the purpose of this book is to say it's not just a political conversation that only happens in political spaces, speeches and conversations in that way, but it also is happening in the marketplace and how people are consuming and creating products for us to buy.
So this gets to one of my core concerns here. And again, the link is in the show description to see the entire video unedited or uninterrupted by me. But Garvey approaching doll making and symbolism in the context of Pan-African political struggle or African nationalist political struggle is one thing. Black women going to work within corporate America as individual apolitical or disorganized, at least in their politics, to work as executives within Coca-Cola and Mattel or wherever else, or the film industry, to produce images of black womanhood for white corporations to sell to black media, black entertainment consume or toy consumers is very different. That's the exact point. As part of a again, my household was the same. No white dolls allowed. Very conscious about all of that. Uh, uh, Even that is a different approach than the suggestion that the production of black dolls, even led by black women executives for white companies, is somehow going to have a similar effect. It is also not the same as an organized political movement taking control over the production of toys and symbols and messaging for political revolutionary purposes. Again, that's not the same as even wanting to produce positive black images within a disorganized, apolitical corporate environment. And I'm hoping I'm making sense here, but I think that distinction needs to be understood and is, I don't think, being made clearly enough here. What seems to happen, and it certainly happens throughout sort of popular discussion and even some academic discussion of these issues, is that almost that all forms of black involvement are a net positive. It misses the Touré point about black visibility not being black power. And it misses the difference between engaging as an organized, politicized entity and engaging as a disorganized individual looking for, at least initially, individual advance with the claim that something is being done for the good of the collective, but producing even what appears to be positive imagery in the context of a depoliticized or apolitical, white supremacist, corporate-controlled, capitalist environment is not the same thing as producing something from within a grassroots revolutionary movement. It kind of gets to the point I've been struggling with for years, that as soon as Kaepernick associates himself with Nike, historically, even before that, as soon as Mos Def and Talib Kweli associated themselves with Toyota and Coca-Cola, or Common does I think also a Toyota or Coca-Cola, as soon as those sort of combinations occur, whatever potential radical messaging would exist within those artists or celebrities or athletes is going to be undercut, if not destroyed entirely. The positive imagery has to be connected to a politicized movement is ultimately, I guess, what I'm saying here.
There's a concept that you use throughout the book in your conversations about Black Barbie and Mattel, to some extent about the Disney princess canon, and definitely this comes up in thinking about Nicki Minaj, but this idea of embodied objectification. Unpack that a little bit for the audience.
Of course. So I started by thinking about, Brittany Cooper and Beyond Respectability. She mentions how Anna Julia Cooper does a lot of speeches specifically about Black women's experience as a part of a political argument, right? So she says, Black women ultimately have an embodied experience that they use to make arguments about respectability, but also about what our place should be in a political conversation.
Right.
So along with that, I think, okay, so there are Black women on pop culture stages like Nicki Minaj, like dolls, like any of these things, who are also thinking about, how do we communicate what Black women's experience is, not only to Black children and other Black people, but to the white people who are also going to buy these dolls, to the other people of color who also are interested in a part of these conversations too. And so my idea around embodied objectification is that, yes, these women are putting themselves on display, like Nicki Minaj, for example, she's out there for everybody to see, but we're also not necessarily seeing her as a person, we're seeing her as a product. Yeah. Right. And so I think it means something that she's communicating to us, this is who I am. This is all of my texture and complexity, but this is a persona. Because when the cameras go off and the Twitter turns down and she disappears into her life, we don't know who that person is. Yeah. So part of my argument with embodied objectification is that there is a distance not only between what's created and what's consumed in an actual person, but also that what's consumed is created with that connection to other Black people in mind. I know what you want because I am also you. And I think that happens when we consume products and also when Black women are creating them.
I guess what I'm struggling with and maybe just confused by is that even when I'm reading Halliday's book, I don't I'm not clear enough that I guess what I'm looking for is that the distinction that she's drawing here between the performance and the real woman off camera behind the scenes is the point. That what is being conveyed as a product, as she correctly says, to Black youth and consumers and others is a construct, is a performance, and is one that is sanctioned by and ultimately most benefiting a white corporate capitalist structure. So I think without clarifying that distinction and then connecting it specifically to this point about counterinsurgency and this co-optive element within capitalism, within colonization, that Black women who want to have themselves, as all of us, want to be reflected. We want to see our stories. We want to be heard. We want our voices to be known. Those in power, through meticulous study and just practice dominance, recognize that need and have turned it against us. So we're not encouraged to say, hey, that artist we see and enjoy that is going to turn off the camera and become more or less a regular person or go back to their regular off-camera life or to their very irregular off-camera life, I don't know. But that what we're getting and being encouraged to interact with is itself a construct and one being disseminated and imposed on us in a particular political context. And it is not something that, again, usurps the power of the state or the corporate world. It's one that usurps it is where the power of the oppressed is usurped by the state and the corporate world. So I'm gonna move ahead here. I'm among several sections or parts of this interview that I've skipped. One of them is where they have a discussion of the first Black woman to work at Mattel to do the Black Barbie, and some of the women who would go in, or some of the discussion around Black women who would go in and work with Disney. There's a discussion of the controversy around the Black princess at Disney, and even a discussion of a Black doll making company that would end up working with Mattel to try to produce, separate from their Black Barbie line, some dolls reflecting a more positive image of Blackness and Black people to Black children. But the point is they would have to work with Mattel. And again, I don't think that point is clarified enough in this discussion, and I'll have to go back and see if I'm not sure how it's clarified in the book, to what extent. That is, the point being that efforts to adjust the symbolic arena are fraught with the existence of a colonial capitalist structure, that Black businesses were not able to take up the work of producing dolls for the Black community to uplift and change the condition of the Black community, or at least the self-concept that would lead to some sort of uplift. And then, even as Dr. Halliday would go on to talk about a little bit about sort of vaguely the different relationship Black people have as consumers to the society, it's not, I think, clarified enough that that difference is often tied up in this counterinsurgency need to impose symbolic change through only capitalist endeavor, still managed, controlled, with the profit benefiting almost exclusively white corporate America, and then symbolically benefiting a white elite that want to offer this idea that Black people can progress, that there's hope on the horizon, and no need to politically organize or develop radical social movements and to assume political power, or to advance some call for a redistribution of the wealth being created by all of this.
The title of the book is By Black, right, which is a historically loaded term. And I think when people see a term like By Black, they have certain kinds of expectations to read narratives about Black nationalist politics, Black nationalist capitalism, right? We think about all the signs in Black communities in the 50s and the 60s. You disrupt that for us by changing the narrative to think about outside of this kind of masculine discourse around Black consumer power and Black capitalism, right? That ultimately at the root of...
By the way, I'm not mad at that. and I haven't seen too much on it, and I haven't focused on it, but I'm not mad at the argument around the masculine nature of Black nationalist, Black capitalist by Black efforts. I think that's a legit point for sure.
This as women who make decisions in households for what gets bought to eat, right? Right. What clothes folks are wearing. I mean, everything, right? You know, there's no Black buying power without, you know, Black women being arbiters of what gets consumed.
Absolutely.
Talking about that.
See, again, but this is part of my point here. That misses the point. Black women being arbiters of what is consumed in a Black household being defined as buying power misses, again, the point of what buying power as a phrase originally means in its concept and deployment by a white political capitalist elite, advertising, branding, marketing community in particular, and suggests, again, that power in that phrase redounds back to the Black household. That's not where power in this case goes. Buying power, in other words, what Professor Anthony Neal in this moment is, or I would prefer to be saying, because what he's speaking to is a power of the Black woman in a Black household to determine which white-owned company and which of made available, promoted, and advertised product will be purchased. It is not a power to determine where the wealth from that exchange, that purchase exchange goes. It is not a power to determine even what products end up being chosen or selected as offered as so-called choice. It's simply a power to enrich one or another white-owned company through the purchase of their product. And I don't think that point is understood or addressed properly here, or really in most places.
Decision to kind of disrupt it, to use this title by Black for the book.
For me, I was really drawn to, especially in the past decade, you know, a lot of people have used Juneteenth, have used Black History Month, have used even the holidays to promote Black producers, right? Okay, buy your candles from this Black maker. When you go to Target, they have, you know, hair products and they have the faces of the, you know, Black women who created these brands. And so everyone, not just Black people, are highly invested in communicating, you should buy from Black people, and this is how to do it. And I was really interested in not only like, why are we so invested in this idea that buying from this particular Black person, even though it's at Target, right? Or even though it's at Macy's, even though it's even though it's Mattel, that, you know, that still is somehow connected to what our political affiliations are around Blackness. And so I hope that the book, you know, extends some of the like nationalist conversation.
But that's her answer, her response, and the missing answer is what was missing in the initial question. What Professor Halliday is responding to, and this is what I'm trying to help and to learn more and to eventually produce this little chapter about, is she's responding to a history of Black capitalism being developed as an ideology, as a subset of an imposed European Eurocentric colonial worldview that tells Black people your salvation is through Black capitalist productivity. So the contradiction she has to point to here of these products being sold in white Targets and stores is part of that uncorrected and often misunderstood contradiction. And it's a contradiction that I think that she is herself caught up in with the discussion of Black women producing relatively, at least, positive Black images or Black women images of Black women, without recognizing that this is part of the cyclical, co-optive, corruptive process that is not corrective. And in the initial question from Anthony Neal, which again misunderstands buying power and Black capitalism, because they're talking about these as actual economic realities or devices or mechanisms, and in both cases, whether it's Black capitalism, whether it's buying power, they are ideologies. They are concepts, social constructs that have only everything to do with suppressing the actual potential power in Black communities or any oppressed community.
That you're talking about, because Black nationalism, even in the sense that we understand it as a political commitment to certain things, it also means that you buy and do certain things. I think about like Tanisha Ford's book around, like even Dressed in Dreams, or more recent book that's about like how we aestheticize ourselves and what that says about our bodies, right? Wearing a dashiki is not the same thing as wearing a t-shirt from Old Navy. It's supposed to communicate something about us and about our commitments. And I want to know why. Even as, you know, Black buying power in the US, and people say that it's a fake thing to think about Black buying power, but it has changed immensely since the 50s and 60s.
No, it hasn't. So I don't know who these people are and to what extent you've engaged the argument, but that's the point. It hasn't changed. That's the history my work traces. That buying power was developed as a concept to suppress the aspirations of labor, and then weaponized particularly against Black people since the 1940s and 50s. So the number changing to now whatever 1.8 or whatever trillion, whatever the claim is today, that change is irrelevant when it comes to what that means in the economy or the relationship Black people have to that economy.
And I think Black people are even more committed to having conversations about what it means to buy Black, even when those products are cultivated.
And they're more committed to that discussion because of the propaganda that keeps encouraging Black people to find their solutions solely within the confines of capitalist production. All right, good people, we're going to leave it there. I hope that even with the cuts and the edits that my argument is being clearly understood. I hope I've been fair to Dr. Halliday's and Anthony Neal's arguments, while acknowledging that I'm dealing with excerpts from a video and not fully addressing the work in Halliday's book. The link to a video where I did address more of the work in her book is in the show description that you can check as well. And of course, I continue to encourage that you engage all of it. As always, thank you for joining me here at I Mix What I Like. And as always, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you right here next time at I Mix What I Like, What I Like, What I Like, What I Like, What I Like.